بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله وسلم عليك يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة. يا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ربنا واجعلنا مسلمين لك ومن ذريتنا أمة مسلمة لك وأرنا مناسكنا وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم، وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters, esteemed guests and scholars, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. One of the most significant events that takes place in the life of the Prophet Ibrahim, as narrated in the Quran, is building upon the foundations of the Kaaba. وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمُ الْقَوَاعِدَ مِنَ الْبَيْتِ وَإِسْمَاعِيلُ. And this is a topic that we glossed over the other day when mentioning the story of Ibrahim. You find that, number one, particularly in the story, that the foundations of the Kaaba were already laid before Ibrahim arrives to the valley of Mecca. His task is to simply build upon that foundation. And when he builds upon that foundation, he does so with his son Ismail, his firstborn. And everything that Ibrahim experienced with Ismail and Ishaq, but particularly in the Islamic tradition, there is an emphasis on Ismail, Ishmael, is significant because Ismail was born to Ibrahim and Hajar after many years. In fact, when the angels first come to Ibrahim to give him tidings of a son that shall be born to him, he says to them, sarcastically, he says to the angels, "What have you come to give me news of? Have you come to give me news that I have reached an old age and that my wife is barren?" They said, "We came to give you good news, and that is the good news of a son, a progeny. And we are ordered to tell you not to lose faith and not to lose hope in the mercy of God." So at an old age, God bestowed Ibrahim with Ismail, and after that he followed up with Ishaq, Isaac. And it is this Ismail, according to the Islamic tradition, that Ibrahim leaves his family, he leaves his people, and he travels to the valley of Mecca, and he performs the rites which today millions of believers from across the globe fulfill, those very same rites in the name of the Hajj pilgrimage, such as the circumambulation around the Kaaba, such as walking the distance between the two mountains of Safa and Marwa, and other significant rites which are a part of the Hajj pilgrimage. After this was said and done, after all the rites were done, Ibrahim, as mentioned in chapter number 2, verse 128, and Ismail, both of them, they turned to God in supplication. And among the verses of their supplication was the following: رَبَّنَا وَاجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ لَكَ. O Allah, allow us to be Muslim with a lowercase m, meaning allow us to submit ourselves completely to you. وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِنَا أُمَّةً مُسْلِمَةً لَكَ. And from our progeny also people who will worship you. This is mentioned in the Bible, actually. It's mentioned where the progeny of Ismail, Ishmael, will be fruitful and multiply exceedingly, and from them shall emerge 12 princes. So Ibrahim, what's significant is that Ismail at that age, it said that he was barely entering the teenage years. However, he stood by the side of his father voluntarily. His father wanted him to be a part of that mission. He wanted him to be a part of that plan. And as we mentioned in one of the first nights, is that when you look at the prophetic family model in the Quran, you find that for the most part, the prophets and the messengers that were sent by God, their families were instrumental and they were significant in furthering their cause, furthering their mission, standing up for that cause and standing up against their adversaries. A prime example of that is the progeny of Ibrahim, Ismail and Ishaq. So both of them stood in front of God and both of them requested that God bless them with a progeny that would continue to carry out the commands of God, that would continue to worship God. رَبَّنَا وَاجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ. The word here is muslimain, which is the dual form. In Arabic you have singular, dual, and plural. This is the dual form, muslimain, meaning both of us. Even though at that age Ismail was not married, nor did he have a progeny at that time. However, he was part of that vision. And Ibrahim, because he had faith and trust in God, and because they had accomplished something so significant together, he had vision. He understood that God was going to bless him in his progeny. And you know, sometimes a part of when we do good for the sake of God, sometimes we don't see that result right away. When you do something good, when you give charity, or when you help bring people together, or when you feed the homeless, whatever it is. Sometimes whenever we perform good acts, we don't see the results right away. However, God shows us the result with our progeny. He blesses our children. He blesses our grandchildren. So understand this, that when you are doing good, you know, it says, the saying is, don't get weary in well-doing. When you're doing well and you don't see the results right away, don't get weary, don't get upset. Maybe God will return the favor to you, not in your lifetime, but after your lifetime, with your children, with your progeny. You see a lot of families today that the children and the grandchildren are blessed because of what the parents and the grandparents did. And this is why we should always strive to do good, if we want God to protect us and protect our children and our grandchildren. وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِنَا أُمَّةً مُسْلِمَةً لَكَ. So they prayed for their progeny. وَأَرِنَا مَنَاسِكَنَا. Show us what we need to do. Show us the path. وَتُبْ عَلَيْنَا. Also forgive us. إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ التَّوَّابُ الرَّحِيمُ. So this brings us to the question is, if it was significant and important, if it was critical for Ibrahim to include his family in his vision, we ask the question today is, what do our youth need in order for us to properly serve them? In order for us to make sure that as parents, as grandparents, as elders in the community, we are paving the path for our children to walk in our footsteps and do good or do better maybe than us. You know, I was reading a report just today. It was saying that most parents who were asked, what is the definition of the American dream? People travel to the United States, to North America for the American dream. 2/3 of those that were asked responded that the American dream is that their children, 2/3 of them, said that their children are better off financially than they are. That's the American dream. Most parents want their children to do better than them. They want their children to exceed them. And there's no competition there. So what do youth need in order for us to be able to serve them? And it's interesting because if you look at the development of children today, of youth today, the different challenges that we have also present different opportunities. There's one saying which is attributed to Amir al-Mu'mineen. It's not clear whether he said this or not, but Some say that it's attributed to him, some say that it was attributed to other philosophers. But anyways, the saying goes like this, something like this. It says that do not compare and use the same measure for your children in their upbringing that was used for you, because they were created for a time that was different from your time. Meaning what? Every time, every generation presents unique opportunities and unique challenges. For instance, if you look at children that are growing up today versus children that grew up only 10 years ago, not 100 years ago, but only 10 years ago. And you look at children that grew up only 10 years before that. The hallmark of the 21st century, it's the age of connectivity. It's the age that the first question you're asked is, what's the Wi-Fi password? And the first answer that you're given is, Google it, right? And so this didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. We had to go through the labor of actually opening up a book, something called a book, and trying to look for answers, or reading in an article. So because there are different challenges today, there are also different methods of upbringing. There are also different opportunities. So you look at, for instance, one thing is social media, the use of social media. Social media in itself is not evil, it's not bad. It's a tool in the same way that a knife is a tool. You can use a knife to injure somebody, but you can also use a knife to maybe save somebody's life. Social media is in the same way. We live in an age where privacy is not so private anymore. And we have to be very careful about what we display on social media, what information that we choose to share with others. We have to be careful also of where we get our information from. Because we live in the age of abundant information, I mentioned this the other night, we also live in an age of abundant misinformation. So as much information there is out there, there's also misinformation. That's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. It's an obstacle, but it's also a reason for us to develop a way in which we can allow our children to navigate this path efficiently. And they don't get caught up in the negative side of things. Rather, they use these tools to further enhance their lives and to further better their understanding of their path in life. So each challenge, each time represents specific obstacles, specific challenges, but also specific opportunities. Which means that you can't simply abandon and say, well, I'm not going to learn how to use the internet. I'm not tech savvy. This isn't something that I grew up with. I didn't grow up with social media, so I don't care about it, and I'll let my children figure it out on their own. That doesn't work. I can speak for myself in our generation, and I'm putting an age on myself, the millennial generation right now. Growing up in the beginning, in the early 90s, mid-90s, late 90s, technology wasn't something that everybody enjoyed. I mean, there was TV and the internet was coming about. But today you have smartphones. Back then we had dumb phones. They weren't very smart. They can only make calls, that's it, and very limited text capability. And you had one game on the phone, that's it. Now you have unlimited access. Now children by the age of 2 or 3 already have devices in their hands. And that's only a matter of 10 years. So imagine this saying that says that do not measure your children and do not measure them according to your standards of upbringing, for they were created for a time which was different from your time. Imagine if these words were uttered 1,500 years ago or 2,000 years ago, when 20 years or 10 years didn't make much of a difference. Imagine how relevant that is today when 10 years makes a vast difference. So it's important to understand what new challenges present with new opportunities. This is one thing. So understanding and acquainting ourselves. The second point is that there are different parenting styles. Because there are different standards of upbringing, because there are different types of children today, there's a new type of child or a new type of youth, one that is connected with people across the globe, there also has to be a different type of parents. Parenting styles must also evolve. There's one psychologist and author and speaker who wrote about this very subject, the different parenting styles. And in a specific chapter in his book, he writes about damaging parenting styles based on his own observations. And he begins the chapter very interestingly. He says, if you've ever noticed the phenomenon of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, maybe some of you have seen this, maybe your children have learned about this in school, and it's a very interesting process. A caterpillar by itself doesn't have wings, it can't fly, it's limited in its mobility, it's limited in its freedom and its strength, it looks a certain way. But that caterpillar, during one stage of its life, decides to become a butterfly and go through a process of metamorphosis. So what happens? It creates a cocoon, a small little shroud sort of thing, and that can last a few days or a few weeks, however long it lasts for. And inside, it develops. It begins to develop into a butterfly. And all of a sudden, what happens? When it's ready to emerge, it begins to break out of the shell, the wrapping of that cocoon, and it begins to fly. Now, the way it looks after is much different than the way it looks before. After, it emerges with wings of all different colors, some of them very spectacular colors. It has freedom, it has grace, it looks completely different. For it to look completely different and develop that wing strength and be able to fly, that cocoon stage is very necessary. What happens if, as a human being, you decide to intervene based on what you think is right, or because something's just aching on the inside, because something's itching on the inside, you can't wait for it to emerge as a butterfly, so you decide to intervene, and you decide to open up that cocoon or just slit it open a little bit too early. What happens? Maybe the whatever it is on the inside, whether it's still a caterpillar or in its embryonic stages of a butterfly, it emerges. But can it fly? Probably not. Can it live on its own? Probably not. Does it have the strength to go out on its own? Probably not. When we look at parenting, and when we look at not only parenting but also teaching styles, we have to understand the parable of the caterpillar to butterfly. And that cocoon stage is very important. So when you look at children being grown in the adolescent stage, the child to adolescent stage, and growing into adulthood, it's the cocoon stage. What happens when a parent tries to intervene or interfere in a way that is not appropriate? The butterfly isn't able to spread its wings. It's not able to carry out the plan that is intended for it. And that's why we really need to understand different parenting styles. And the reason I bring this in this night is because in this night, we remember Al-Qasim ibn al-Hasan, one of the youth that was with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And when he stood by the side of his uncle and he went and fought out into the battlefield, and the interaction that he had with his uncle. So usually the night of the 7th is the night in which we mention the challenges that the youth are facing. Now this author puts it in the following way, and I want to share this with you. The different parenting styles. There are different, what he refers to as damaging parenting styles, and each one of these parenting styles has a specific name. And based on the name, you can kind of tell what kind of parenting style this is. So the first one he says that he observes is helicopter parents. What's a helicopter parent? What does a helicopter do? It hovers above. Have you ever seen when there's an accident nearby or an incident which is going on nearby and the helicopter comes and it hovers above? He says what helicopter parents do is that they hover above their children always, and they don't allow their children to make mistakes. And when you look at the modern education system today, it's based upon what? How is success determined? Is it based on failure? It's not based on failure. Is it based on attempts? It's not based on attempts. It's based on the passing grade that you get. It's all about the grade. Some children, you find they don't even need to attempt in order to get an A. But some children, they attempt, or some youth, they attempt really their hardest, and the best that they can do is a C or a B minus. What does this tell us? This tells us that in today's world, in today's philosophy, the value is given upon, is assigned to the end results more than the actual process. However, if you begin to focus on the process, you build the ability to achieve results. versus getting results effortlessly. And you find people who are able to get results effortlessly in school. What happens when they go out into the real world? They have no idea how to function. They have no idea how to interact. We had a classmate when they used to, I believe they still do the SATs, correct? For high school, they do the SATs. And the SATs today are out of 2,600 points, something like that. Before, they were out of 1,400 points. And in our school, the school that I attended, there was a classmate who got a 1,400. And it was surprising because I looked at myself after attempting the SAT 3 or 4 times. And out of those 4 times, I never had the time to even complete all of it. Not only did she complete all of it, she completed all of it before time and she got a 1,400 and she was featured in the newspaper. But what happened? She began to apply to different universities. Among those universities in California, we have Stanford University, which is one of the most prominent, and wasn't accepted. Why? Because she failed the interview. Because there's no effort, there's no social skills which are taught. There's only brain power. There's no street smarts that are taught. So what happens with helicopter parents is that they hover and they try, instead of working on the child, for the child to be able to walk the path properly, they try to work on the path instead of the child. And what happens when that child is no longer at home, when that adolescent graduates from the home? They're unable to manage emotions because we're so afraid of failure. We're so afraid of allowing our children to go out and try. Now, that doesn't mean that you leave them completely on their own, but it doesn't mean that you hold their hand and you hover above them at every stage of their life. So this is one type, is helicopter parents. And when you actually allow people to fail, you allow them to grow. So if we were really interested in our children growing, we allow them to fail. Another type is karaoke parents. What's karaoke? If you've seen karaoke, people go up there and they try to sing a song by a pop star or a rock star. They try to sound and act and imitate what that person is doing. Karaoke parents are parents that try too hard. They try to be their kid's buddy and their friend. They try to sound like them and they try to dress like them. What does this do? Often the child becomes confused. Is this my dad? Is he my buddy or is he my leader? Is he the person that is my friend and I can just joke around with him all the time and I don't have to take him seriously? Or is this person a leader who has to set the proper example for me? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be your child's friend, but you can't play the role of your child's parent and your child's absolute best friend. It doesn't work that way, at least not with the millennial generation. So we have to ask ourselves, do our children need buddies or do they need leaders? Another type of parents are the dry cleaner parents. What's the role of a dry cleaner? You wear your suit for a month or for 6 months or a year, and then you take it and you drop it off at the dry cleaner and you pick it up in pristine condition. And you've seen this especially within Muslim communities, where a child is taken and dropped off at the masjid or dropped off at the Islamic school, and they expect a miracle to happen. They expect that after an hour or 2 hours of weekend school that their child comes out in pristine condition. Yes, being at the masjid, being at the school facilitates their learning experience. However, you cannot give a child at the masjid or at the Islamic school what they're not already receiving at home. They need to first see that role model at home in order for the masjid or the school to be effective for them. And most of the time you see that this happens because of a lack of time. We say that we don't have time. However, when we say we don't have time, what that means is that we really have to figure out what our priorities are. What's my priority? Is my priority going out and working overtime and making more money? Yes, maybe that will allow you to provide a little bit more for your family, but what's worth more? Giving more materials to your family or giving more discipline and learning and teaching to your family? So we have to figure out what our priorities are. Then there's the volcano parents. What are the volcano parents? A volcano, it simmers for a few years. It can simmer for decades. Sometimes it can simmer for centuries. And then what happens? All of a sudden, when it erupts, all the villagers have to flee for their lives. And the villagers is everybody that's around. The relatives, the school, the principal, the teachers, everybody has to run for their lives. Now, what this means isn't parents that get angry or maybe upset. That's okay because you have an emotional vested interest. What is meant by volcano parents are parents that live vicariously through their children. They do their homework for them. They write their papers for them. They do everything for them, but when things don't go the way that they want, they erupt like a volcano. So this is another type of parenting. It's volcano. And sometimes you find that these parents have to deal with their own issues. Then there's the dropout parent, in the same way that people drop out of school because they find that it's too hard. They drop out of a graduate program because they see it requires too much of an investment. You have dropout parents, parents who simply give up. And this doesn't mean that the parent leaves the home. Sometimes the parent is there physically, but they're not there. Have you ever seen sometimes a parent is there, but they're not there? They're just there physically. That's it. They're not there emotionally. Your child needs you to be there emotionally. Your child needs to know that you love them and you care for them, even if they reach a certain age, even if it shows like they're busy with their homework and with their friends and with school and with their extracurricular activities. At the end of the day, none of that compensates for the love of a parent, for the care, the emotional care that someone takes from their parent. You know, and the Quran has so many examples of that. If you study Surah Luqman, the wise man, some suggest that he was a prophet, but he was a wise man. When he speaks to his son, he speaks to him in a language of endearment. Ya bunayya la tushrik billah. Bunay, my dear son. Now we don't know how old he is. Doesn't say that he was a baby. Doesn't say that he was an adolescent. Maybe he could have been an older man. But he still refers to him as bunay, my dear son. That's a term of endearment. Then you have the bullied parents. We feel sorry for the bullied parents. The doormat parents. Have you ever seen when one child bullies another child? When they push them around and when they kick them? Sometimes the children do that to their parents. They push them around and they kick them. And the parent becomes like a doormat. And the solution for this is you need to get a backbone. You need to surround yourself with people that can support you. And there needs to be clear lines which are drawn. Sometimes some of the most dysfunctional families you find are when the parents are bullied by the children, when they're pushed around by the children, when they have to act as slaves for their children. This is one type. Another type is the groupie parent. Now, groupie is a term which is assigned to people that, young people that follow around pop stars and rock stars, and they bask in their glory. And sometimes you find these examples on TV with these pageant parents, these beauty pageant parents. Maybe some of you have seen. They're obsessed with their children's appearance in front of people. They have to take them to every single social activity, and they have to make sure that their children are number one. And sometimes it's as if they themselves, they have missed out on something in their childhood, so they have to live vicariously through their children. Understand that your child doesn't only need a servant. Your child needs a leader. Being a leader is more important to your child than only being a servant and serving their every single need. And finally, the commando parents. These are the parents that demand perfection. Everything has to be perfect. Your room has to be spotless. Your grades have to be spotless. Everything has to be spotless. Everything has to be perfect. And this goes back to our first point, is that sometimes we focus on the results so much that we're not focusing on the process. We're not focusing on the journey. We're not focusing on the growth. We're not focusing on the development. What our children need most, especially in this contemporary world, is spiritual development. They have to learn how to develop if they are going to go out and tackle all the challenges. If they are going to go out and be representatives of Islam and the Ahlul Bayt, what do they need? They need to learn to grow. They need to learn self-image. When you go to school, you graduate with a piece of paper. You don't graduate with self-image. Children are not taught self-image in school. Where are they taught self-image? When they look up to their parents. And this is why that example of Ibrahim and Ismail is so beautiful. Because Ibrahim and Ismail, they built something together. And it's so significant when you can build something. Have you ever seen when a father and a son, they build something together, a tree house or something? And you feel that sense of accomplishment? That's exactly the model of Ibrahim and Ismail. They built something together. And then they said, oh Allah, allow us to perpetuate this within our families. So the reason I mention these different parenting types is not to criticize or condemn and say that the parents are evil. In most of these cases, the parents are good-hearted, but it's just a matter of having the right information and knowing how to respond to challenges in an appropriate manner. Knowing that in every time and in every age, we need to be open to learning new methods and learning new ways. Maybe before, the way to discipline children was to wrap them up against a wall or a palm tree and whip them on the back. Maybe that worked 80 years ago, but do you think that works today? It doesn't work. That does not, abuse does not work. Physical abuse does not work. Mental abuse does not work. Verbal abuse, it does not work. If you want something better, you need to learn new methods. And this brings us to our third point, that the most important thing that we have in our lives are relationships. If we want our children to succeed, we need to foster and build relationships. How do we build relationships? There's a concept that some authors refer to, and we mentioned this in passing the other day, the emotional bank account. Each one of us, we have an emotional bank account. And that emotional bank account has a trust reserve. In the same way that your bank account works today, you can't make withdrawals if you haven't made sufficient deposits. In the same way, that emotional bank account requires us to make deposits before we make withdrawals. Deposits are to add trust or to do things that facilitate trust. Withdrawals are to do things that deplete that trust, to remove that trust. And our children are watching us. And every relationship, by the way, this isn't just a parent-child relationship. Any relationship that you want to have, a successful relationship, whether it's with your spouse, whether it's with your employer or your employees, whether it's with your colleagues and classmates, whether it's with your friends, depend on one factor, the major factor, the significant factor is trust. When there is trust, there is transparency, and that relationship can thrive. So how do we make emotional bank accounts? We'll wrap up with this. Number one, there are 6 points. Number one is understanding the individual through listening. The Quran tells us, الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلِ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَهُ. Listening, developing the skill of listening. How many of us actually listen to our spouses when they nag and complain? How many of us actually listen to our children or our coworkers? I was reading the other day, it was saying the average interruption takes place 17 seconds after someone has spoken. That's the average interruption. We have to interrupt. We have to interject. So understanding how to listen, الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلِ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَهُ. Those who listen, the Quran says, they know how to listen, and then they follow what is most beneficial. Meaning that sometimes you're going to listen to things which is not beneficial. Sometimes your child is going to come excited to you and tell you the story about how they saw a dog. And it's probably the most boring thing ever. But you have to be interested. Likewise, when it comes to your spouse, maybe they don't always say the right thing. Your colleagues, your employer, especially your employer. But you have to be able to listen. When we know how to listen, that's when we know how to understand a person. Number two is when we keep our commitments. When we say we're going to do something, we follow through with that commitment. When we make a promise, we follow through with that commitment. Number three is clarifying expectations. How many of us do we actually talk about what our expectations are? I was reading an article, it was talking about things which are not addressed before people get married, which show up after people get married and cause problems. It was a listing of about 5 or 6 things. Among them are finances. If someone is carrying, debt or baggage with them. Things that need to be discussed without judgment. So when we clarify our expectations for our children, it's important. Sometimes, we don't clarify expectations because we underestimate our children. We think our children or our youth By the way, when I say children, I mean children and youth. That they won't understand, that they can't keep expectations. You'd actually be very surprised. Some youth are better in holding up their expectations than their adult parents. Another thing is attending to the little things. What does that mean? That means that you have expectations, you're expected to do certain things, but then a level beyond that is doing things not because you have to. Those are attending to the little things. All of these things are considered deposits in the trust emotional bank account. Another thing is showing personal integrity. When you show integrity and your uprightness, and this reflects through your character, it reflects through your behavior. When people show integrity, when they show moral uprightness, they tend to earn people's respect and their trust. And last but not least is when you make a withdrawal, you apologize. Now there's a list of withdrawals you can make, and you've probably thought about this in your head, that because maybe you've had relatives who have made withdrawals time and time again. For instance, if somebody's unstable emotionally, one day they're happy, one day they're angry. One day they're happy, one day they're angry. Those are considered withdrawals. Every time a person loses their mind and loses their anger, that's considered a withdrawal. So the last point is apologizing when you make a withdrawal. When we apologize, when we learn to apologize. Sometimes our egos are way too big for us to apologize to anybody. But apologizing, when apology is due, is actually a virtue. And trust relies on daily deposits. We need to ask ourselves, where are our investments? Where are we protecting our investments? So, to wrap this up is, if we want to make sure that we are not interfering with that cocoon stage and we are allowing our children to grow and develop physically and mentally and spiritually, we need to check our methods. We need to check our intentions. We need to be able to learn. Sometimes we get to an age where we don't want to learn anything anymore. But in every age, we have to work on ourselves. One narration, it says that if a person, his 2 days are similar, then he is at loss. Meaning that if he has not progressed from one day to another day, then he is at loss. Meaning that every day, if we want to succeed and if we don't want to lose, if we don't want to be considered losers, we have to progress every single day. We have to learn something every single day. Some of the most successful people in the world, they continue to learn well past the ages that they're in school. Some people, they learn a new language when they're 60 years old. I personally know people who learn a new language when they're 60 years old. They continue to learn when they're 65 and 70 and 75 and 80 and 85. And today people are living longer than they are before. It's important that we continue to learn how to treat people around us. And the most important people are our children, because they are those of the future. رَبَّنَا وَاجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ لَكَ. This was the wish of Ibrahim. And everything Ibrahim did was in front of his sons, Ismail and Ishaq. Tonight is the night that we remember Al-Qasim ibn al-Hasan. And Al-Qasim was one of a few brothers, sons of Al-Imam al-Hasan, that were present on the day of Ashura. And all of them, narrators tell us that all of the sons of Al-Imam al-Hasan were killed on that day except for one son that was injured. He was taken back to Medina. And those today who find their lineage from Al-Imam al-Hasan is through this one son who survived the day of Ashura. But the rest of them were all killed, and they were all young. And when Al-Imam al-Hasan died in the year 51 after Hijrah, when he was poisoned, his children came under the care of their uncle Al-Husayn alayhi salam. So they were raised by their uncle. They saw the model of their uncle. They saw that he was a role model. And they had already inherited those characteristics of strength and bravery and courage from their father. Little is said about Al-Imam al-Hasan. Sometimes we mention the Prophet, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Hussein, but very little do we say about Al-Imam al-Hasan. And this is a testimony to the fact that he was oppressed. That even 1400 years later, rarely do we mention the example of Al-Imam al-Hasan and what he stood for. The nobility, the character, the courage, the bravery. So much so that some of the closest people, they turned against him. One of the companions, he comes to Al-Imam al-Hasan after the treaty with Muawiyah, he says, I wish that on that day that you died and all of us died, so that we would not have to witness this day of living under the reign of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Imagine hearing this from your closest companions. Imagine betrayal from within your own family. On that day, after the companions had gone out into the battlefield, and when the family of Imam Hussein began to go out, the family, the men, the young men began to go out into the battlefield one by one. The first one was Ali al-Akbar, who we will mention tomorrow. Among them were Al-Qasim ibn al-Hasan. And Al-Qasim was a young man. He was a young adolescent. He had still not experienced having his own family. And so he found himself on that day wanting to go out into the battlefield. And narrations tell us that he was first turned down by his uncle Hussein, but he had with him a letter that was written by his father. And his father, just like the Prophet, and by the way, there are multiple narrations where the Prophet told the companions, not only in our Shi'i books of hadith, but in the Sunni books of hadith, that the Prophet informed the community of what would happen to his grandson Hussein in Karbala. Imam Ali alayhi salam, it is said in one narration that as he was going towards Siffin, which is between northern Iraq and northern Syria today, they were passing by Nainawat, the land of Karbala. And he made a remark. He said, Sabran ya Aba Abdullah, about his son Hussein. Some of the companions that were there, they remarked that they had heard the Prophet, when Imam Hussein was born, say that this son will be killed after me. And so the Prophet knew, Imam Ali alayhi salam knew, and Imam al-Hasan knew what was going to happen to his brother. So he had written a letter in order to prepare. That letter Al-Qasim found and he brought to his uncle Hussein on that day in order to seek permission. And when he read that letter, the letter said, it was written to Al-Qasim, it said, Bunayya Qasim, إذا اشتدت عليك الأمور فعليك بنصرة عمك الحسين. O Qasim, one day you will find yourself in tragedy. You will be facing calamity. On that day, your obligation is to come to the rescue of your uncle Hussein. When Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he read this letter, he began to weep. How could he let this young man who was an orphan, how could he let him go out into the battlefield? He did not want to risk those very precious lives. But he turned to Qasim, and he told him, Bunayya Qasim, my dear Qasim, what do you see in death? How do you perceive death? And Qasim replied with full conviction. He said, Ya am fi nusratikum ahla min al-asali. If it is to support your cause, if it is in your defense, then I find death to be sweeter than honey. Narrations say that Imam Hussein embraced Qasim and they wept until they fell on the floor, both of them. When Imam Hussein got up, he turned to Zainab alayhi salam. He said, Ukhayya Zainab, itini bi'imamat akhi al-Hasan. My dear sister Zainab, bring for me the turban and the armor and the sword of my brother al-Hasan. When he brought it, it was too large to be wrapped around his head. So Imam Hussein took that cloth, he tore it into two pieces. One piece he wrapped around the head of the young boy. One piece he wrapped around the torso of the young boy in order to hold up his armor. He blessed him and he sent him out into the battlefield. When Al-Qasim went out into the battlefield, he began to introduce himself. Many people from the enemy side, they had not seen him before. They did not recognize him. However, they recognized the light of Bani Hashim, and he began to say to them, In tankuruni fa ana najlul Hasan. If you do not know who I am the son of Al-Hasan. I am the grandson of Ali ibn Abi Talib. I am the grandson of the Prophet. And he went out into the battlefield. He began to fight against the enemy. When the enemy soldiers saw that he was a young boy without protection, going out alone, one of them called out to Imam Hussein. He said that I will bereave you of this child. I will bereave you of this nephew of yours. Al-Qasim, when he began to fight in the battlefield, all of a sudden in the pinnacle of the battle, the narrators say that he was wearing sandals, and one of the wraps around the sandals, it snapped. So in order to fix it, he bent down. At that moment, as he was bending down, one of the enemy soldiers came to him and he struck him with a sword upon his head. When he struck him with the sword, the blood began to gush out. He could not see his way. The enemy soldiers, they gathered around him. They began to rain upon him. They began to strike upon him from every side. At that moment, he began to call out to his uncle Hussein, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah. He called out to him. Imam Hussein alayhi salam ran out into the battlefield. Narrations say that it was like an eagle which pounced into the battlefield, which dove into the battlefield. As he arrived near Qasim, he unsheathed his sword and he attacked the killer, killing the attacker of Al-Qasim. He says to his nephew Al-Qasim, Ya'uzu Allah ala ammik. It is so dear unto your uncle that you call
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين